I remember the hands of my grandmother. They were scarred with the lines of sacrifice. They were heavy with the passing of time. They carried grief, the grief of being forced off her homeland. But her hands were as strong as they were fragile. So strong that even the Greek god Zeus would have worshipped them. I remember the face of my grandmother, the lines of a lifetime of suffering, and the lines on her face of a lifetime of love. The love that it took to survive, to carry my father, to be the man that one day would carry me. My grandmother was a lioness, did everything it took to protect and to save her family. Public monuments should be built of her, that people worship at every sunrise and sunset. I stand on the land of a once occupied people, of a people that were destined for the seas and the mountains as the only way to be free and safe. I stand on the land of a people where it was gunshots that used to usher in another day of disappearances. I stand on the land of a people where once the dream of growing old with your family and your friends was a thing of fairy tales. I stand on the land of a people who for centuries have fought occupation, who have sacrificed for the dream of freedom, opportunity, education, your culture, your values, your community here in Timor-Leste. This is the land upon which I stand. Stand on the land of a very brave people, a courageous people, who through having the heart of David brought Goliath to his knees. But there are no more words for your country or for my grandmother anymore. There are no words to speak of the courage and bravery of the Timorese people. There are no words anymore to speak of my grandmother as a heroine, of her bravery as a refugee to survive a genocide and the occupation of the Nazis and to still be standing tall. She would be but a footnote on self-inflicted human misery. What I'm talking about is that right now we have a global conversation about refugees that don't see them as human beings anymore, that see them as a burden, a threat, a danger, something to be feared, to be stopped, to be demonized. How? How did we find ourselves at this point? Why did we cede the high moral ground to racists, to fearmongers, to people bereft of an immoral imagination or a moral compass? How did we allow ourselves to reach such a crossroads? If things are to change, and what my talk is about that change is possible. We're going to have to come up with a new narrative, a new conversation. The one my grandmother and your country used to be spoken of as. But it's going to be on us. And just as important as what we say from here on in is just as important as what we stop saying. The horrible realization I've had recently is that those who care about refugees, those who stand side by side with refugees as allies, are often the biggest problem. We spend so much time defending and excusing what refugees are not, that we've stopped talking about what they are. We have a vocabulary as long as Homer's Odyssey to decimate the humanity of refugees, but we are bereft of words that humanize them. So let's start with what we're going to stop doing. We're going to stop talking about and apologizing for the number of refugees around the world. We'll start apologizing and excusing that when the people that start the wars, deter the democracy, deny the science of climate change, seek to oppress and to persecute minorities, when they start apologizing, we will too. We're going to stop talking about borders and border protection because that language plants the seed of fear. And we're going to stop talking about it until we, as a global community, no longer want globalization, no longer want cheap labor and traffic people through open borders, where you can't have it both ways. Free open borders for trade, but when human beings seek protection across those borders, there is no room at the inn. We're going to stop talking about queues. It's a fiction. And the more we talk about refugees aren't jumping queues or threatening our borders, the more we feed into a narrative that demonizes them. Let's start talking about queues when the West actually creates such a thing, instead of cages and prisons and bars and places to lock up more and more refugees. Like my country, Australia, that would rather spend 5 times what the UNHCR spends in Asia per annum to lock up a couple of thousand refugees in an island prison on Nauru and Manus Island and leave them there to be terrorized and raped. For that is its purpose. So let us stop speaking of a fiction that doesn't even exist. There is no queue. There is but chaos for refugees. And it's a human bloody lottery where you are born. And whether you're born into what my grandmother was born into, or you're born into the freedom that I taste each day in Australia. We're going to stop talking about boats. Stopping the boats, turning back the boats. Amnesty International came out last week and talked about how there are now 30 countries, led by Australia's example, that now turns refugees back. But when you hear the word boats, people go, it's just boats we're turning back. Let's stop using that language. Let's find our own. It's not boats. It's people. It's not boats being turned back. It's hope. It's life. It's freedom. It's someone's grandmother. It's not boats being returned like some ghost ship to some anonymous port where they'll dock quietly and safely. It is human beings in need of protection being returned into the arms of their torturers. This is what is happening. For those who care about refugees, we need to stop talking about the cost savings. But it's so much cheaper to settle them than it is to do this and this and this. The more we argue about what is right based on economics, the more we unintentionally put a price on human rights, depending on a cost-benefit analysis as to whether you and you should live. Is it economical sense rather than it is a moral sense? We're going to stop talking about people seeking asylum as not illegal. I spent a lifetime using that language. They are not illegal. And the first thing you think of is your right to save your life apparently now rests on an interpretation of a point of law. Madness. We're not going to be sitting there anymore defending refugees and saying they are not a burden. We're not going to be sitting there anymore and talking about them not being terrorists. The minute we say that is the minute the average person in this audience goes, well, maybe they are. We need to be talking about a new language that actually says they are the consequence of terrorism. They are its first victims of terrorism. The next time you see a terrorist act, the first conversation we should be having is about the empathy and compassion we should have towards refugees around, this is why they flee. We're going to stop talking about stopping deaths at sea. You might be asking me, why? Do you support that happening? No, of course not. No one wants people dying at sea. But have you once heard in that narrative and conversation, a conversation about why they get on those boats in the first place? Why they are fleeing in the first place? Why they are jeopardizing everything to go onto a leaky boat in the first place? That conversation is never happening. Never happening. So for those who care about refugees, we're going to start by creating an entire new narrative and conversation. We're going to control that narrative. We are going to make a commitment from today that we are no longer going to be talking about what refugees are not. I was watching the news the other night, and refugees stuck between France and England are in a refugee camp in Calais. And the media was talking about it as a jungle. And in the background I could see children. And I'm thinking, are those children hearing that? A jungle of savages, of animals, of something to fear. At a time where we have more refugees than we have since World War II, we need to stop defending them. Never utter the words again, they are not illegal, they are not queue jumpers, they are not terrorists. Stop talking about boats. Stop talking about stopping deaths at sea. Stop talking about the economic benefits of doing the right thing. So then what am I talking about? Where are we going to start? What are we going to do? We're going to seize the moral high ground. Yeah. Because we're on the right side of history. We're on the right side of truth. We're on the right side of humanity. So we're going to seize the moral high ground and start talking about what is right. And we're going to start with the most basic thing, which is seeking asylum is the most fundamental human right known to humanity. Put up your hand here in the audience if there are any of you here who think you don't have the right to decide whether you live or die. Well, put up your hand then if you think that someone else should decide how you try to save your life. No hands. No hands. Let's start talking about rights. Let's start talking about fairness. Let's start talking about values. At the heart of it, we're going to start talking about people. We're not going to use the word asylum seeker anymore. You hear that word, and you hear a label that eviscerates empathy for those very people. None of you relate to that. We're going to talk about people, mothers, fathers, children, family. We're going to talk about values, because this is what it is about. Every decision you make in your day-to-day life is based on the values that you were raised with and the values that you carry from the kitchen table to your church, to your work, to your friends. So let's talk about a narrative that actually places refugees in our moral universe, one where we can relate. We can do that by doing things such as talking about safe passage, that everyone seeking asylum deserves safe passage. Safe passage is built on an understanding that no one chooses to get onto a boat, that they do so because the land is often more dangerous than the sea. Safe passage talks about dealing with the root causes, safe hubs, safe processing, safe resettlement. Let's talk about contribution. Let's talk about the extraordinary contribution of refugees. There is no greater anti-poverty measure known to humankind than the entrepreneurship of refugees. It runs in their very DNA and bloodline. They make every country greater through their resilience, through their courage, and through their contribution. Let's tell that story. Let's name the cause of what causes refugees to be persecuted. These are things that are decided by people, chosen by people, controlled by people. The minute we name it, so in my country, when I name the government that does this, suddenly it's a human-created problem. And with a human-created problem, it's a problem that can also be sorted by what? By human beings. Let's actually start talking in a way that actually mobilizes and energizes our base. That we need a message and a narrative that those who care about refugees are going to be inspired by. Because if they won't champion your message, then no one else is going to. Let's have a message that alienates our opposition. Let's use the words that they don't want us to be talking. That refugees want to contribute. They want to integrate. They share our values. They're seeking peace. They love democracy. That's a narrative that our opponents have to fight against. Let's persuade the middle through a narrative around values, through a narrative around morality, that life is precious, that the sanctity of life does not rest on what is politically expedient, but on what, as moral, caring human beings, we commit to each day of our lives that we want to role model to our families and to our children. Let's have at the center of this the voices of refugees. Let them speak for themselves. Let them lead this movement. Let us amplify their voices. Who better to speak about the resilience, the courage, the contribution than refugees themselves? But let's abandon all labels as well. For seeking asylum is a moment in time. It's not your identity. Your identity is like your grandparents' identity during occupation. Resilient, courageous, loving their family, loving the community, proud of where they come from. This is the story and narrative of refugees. I am hopeful. This can happen in our lifetime. Let us speak the truth. Let us be fearless. Let us be passionate. Let us rise for refugees. Let us tell it as it is. Let us talk to the heart. Let us talk to what is moral. Let us talk about what is just. Let us talk about what is fair. Let us stop defending your right, my right, the right of millions of people around this universe to save their lives. The most precious gift that any one of you would give to your family. Whatever it took, whatever happened, you would risk everything to keep your family safe. Because why? You're loving, caring people. And that's who refugees are. Let us claim the human in human rights again. Let freedom ring from the Bay of Dili, where Christ watches over, to your coffee plantations. Let freedom ring. Let freedom ring for every refugee around this earth right now. Let's make it happen. Thank you.